Our goal for this term is to bring all the young professionals and the energy community together to provide them with an inspirational talk to provoke discussion and raise awareness in such a safe environment like NMO. I would like to thank our speaker for today, Dr. Yousef AlShammari. We are very happy to have you here and we're very honored. And now I will leave it to Fawaz, our moderator. Fawaz, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fatma. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. This is Fawaz Al-Bughail, a petroleum engineer working for Saudi Aramco, and it gives me a great pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. Today, SPE-KSA is delighted to present to you another series of NMO. And yes, as the Arabic definition of the name suggests, this is the series provides an opportunity for professionals to have a mind-opening discussions to accelerate and enable the growth of their knowledge. To accelerate and enable the growth of their knowledge, and also to provide an opportunity to engage with exceptional experts like Dr. Yousef today. In our previous session, we had insightful discussion with Dr. Salim Al-Gharbi, the manager of planning in Sadaya. We talked about the digital transformation and its role in the petroleum and the oil and gas industry. And today it gives us a great honor to have Dr. Yousef AlShammari to talk about the bigger picture of the oil and gas industry, about the dynamics, trends, where are we today, and what do the future hold for the market of oil and gas. Dr. Yousef is the CEO and head of oil research and sea markets, and he is a senior research fellow at Imperial College with more than 10 years of experience in energy market research. He is an eminent energy market consultant where he has been hosted by numerous news agencies and TV shows to provide his valuable insight on matters related to the energy market. Dr. Yousef is also an energy columnist. He wrote many articles for Forbes, Oil Price, CNN Arabic, and other media outlets. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yousef. As you can tell from the way I appear, this is an informal and casual meeting. Basically, we want to provide a safe environment for everyone to interact and engage with the doctor to basically get the most out of this learning experience. The format of this session today, inshallah, the doctor will give us almost 40 minutes presentation, and then we'll be able to have a roundtable discussion with the doctor. Doctor, the mic is yours.
Thank you. So, first, I would like to thank you, Mohammed, for Fawaz for the incredible introduction, and I am honored by this very hospitable audience, and I thank the organizers for organizing this wonderful event. The SPE has been an important part of my career. I remember back in 2009 when I started my PhD. I was a member of the SPE London club in London. So I used to attend their events and meet with engineers working with various oil and gas companies. So it has supported my growth back in the days. So I am very much value this event, and also I'm also very honored to meet with fellow brothers and sisters working at Aramco and other companies in the kingdom, and one of the most important sectors that is essential for the world's economic growth. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to share you my experience, and I don't want to say that I am the best expert in the market. I just would like to share my expertise, and I'm 100% sure I'll learn a lot from you. So what I would like to speak about today, as I was requested to speak about oil markets, and that's my business, which has been going on for the past, let's say, since 2017 somehow, since I started sea markets. Before that, I was doing research in energy economics at various universities. If we move the slides a little bit. So if you just can tell from, I just wanted, because I realized that you are young engineers, and maybe the pathway that I have gone through can be useful. How I moved from, especially my educational profile, to where I am now. So I started back in 2005. I was at GIC in Jubail here, just not far from here. And when I graduated, I was not sure if I'm going to continue my undergraduate studies or not. So there was a high uncertainty, I would say, about pursuing my further education. So lucky enough, I was lucky to have an offer from the UK to attend a 2-year program to do an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering. So lucky enough that the University of Nottingham has accepted the course curriculum which I did in Jubail at that time. Although it was not even ABIT accredited, and as you know now, currently most Saudi universities in engineering are all recognized by the ABIT. At that time, GIC wasn't even accredited by the ABIT. So to get acceptance by the University of Nottingham, which is one of the world's 100 best universities, was a major breakthrough in my education. So I was happy that I became an engineer back in 2008. So now, well done. And I remember some of my colleagues at that time many actually were from Aramco. Still we are in friendships. Following that, I decided to stay 1 year more, so because I did it in 2 years. So why not staying 1 more year more to do a master's? Then I stayed again in Nottingham. Of course, lucky enough that my government sponsor in Jubail, which was the Royal Commission, said, okay, he spent only 2 years. All right, stay one more year again to do the master's. So I did a master's degree, and on my master's, I did much better grade. I got a much higher grade compared to my bachelor's, because coming from Saudi Arabia, going to the UK, they destroyed me with my GPA. They told me, oh, you're going to get only 2.2. You cannot get a 2.1. So I got 2.2. I accepted the fact that, yes, I'm not 2.1, I'm 2.2. But they accepted me to do a master's degree. So on my master's degree, I got 68. That is almost close to a first class. So kind of I got into compensation. So after that, I was going around in the UK, so I was invited to go to a meeting in London at Imperial College, and there I met with my PhD supervisor, this guy. And he said, all right, you're from Saudi, you're doing something related to chemical engineering, why don't you and I work on something related to oil? All right, that sounds interesting idea. And then I had to write a proposal into the idea that he gave to me, which was something related to underground gasification of hydrocarbons, basically producing hydrogen from oil. Well, I had to explain this back to people in Jubail, what you're really going to do. And there was also an agreement between KAUST, which was established at that time, and Imperial. So I kind of have benefited from this joint collaboration between the two. So people in Jubail, all right, it seems interesting. Let's give this guy 3 more years to do a PhD in this special topic. So I went to London, and in London, the bad thing is that London was so enjoyable. Of course, when you hear about London, maybe you think about Harrods, Knightsbridge, Big Ben, or Canary Wharf. That's what tourists really think about London. But believe me, if you go to Imperial College, maybe you'd hate being in London, because they will let you stay in the lab for the next 3 years. So essentially, I was stuck in the lab for at least 3 years, basically designing the lab equipment, running experiments, testing samples. It was a real let's say one of the most challenges, or one of the most difficult challenges I had to go through during my studies. So my PhD was most challenging, but also perhaps one of the most exciting. And during that time, I was in London, so you're connected, everything is close by. World Energy Council is next door, Energy Institute, British Parliament, and also you all know that London is as a hub for the world's largest financial banks. So essentially, and I remember going every morning to the tube station and seeing these bankers at HSBC and Citibank and JP Morgan, and all right, why am I in the lab? Well, maybe one day I want to work with these bankers. So the idea stayed in my mind. All right, maybe one day I want to become a banker, not a chemical engineer. So I used to tell my supervisor that idea, and then he told me, stay until you finish your PhD and then do whatever you like to do, because he was worried that I'm not going to continue the PhD. So until I finished my PhD, and then I was searching for an opportunity in energy economics. So, because I'm a chemical engineer, right? We all get that. I was working on hydrogen, but I wanted to do something related to energy economics just to satisfy my passions, which that's something I had while being in London. Maybe if I didn't go to London, I wouldn't do energy economics. So after that, I was searching for places. I was thinking about the UN. So I went to the IAEA, the website, International Atomic Energy Agency, and I found an opportunity there to do an internship in nuclear production of hydrogen, techno-economic assessment, something. So I applied to that internship, and lucky enough, I got acceptance. So I moved then from London to Austria. And then in Austria, I had spent 1 year working on energy economics. So that is, now we are in 2013, all right? So working at the IAEA and techno-economic assessment of energy economics has been the door for me to specialize in the field and in fact to enable me to where I am now. Because at that time I started attending OPEC meeting because OPEC is in Vienna, and I remember attending the first OPEC meeting back in 2013. That was with Mr. Al-Badri, Mr. Abdullah Al-Badri, who was the former Secretary General of OPEC for many, many years. And in fact, one of the legends, in fact, also in the industry. After that, I was also searching for another, because I finished my PhD, I did an internship in energy economics, so I decided to stay in the field. I didn't want to come back to the lab. Even my supervisor, when I went back to London, he said that I don't think you will ever come back to work in my laboratories. So he said for me, I would recommend that you stay to continue in the same field as you have been in your internship. So I applied to various universities, ATH, Imperial, here at Watt, and other universities in the UK, but no one was interested to hire me as a postdoctoral in energy economics because my PhD is in chemical engineering. Until KSA came to me and they hired me to work in the same area as in my internship. So, spending 2 years at KSA, I have published 2 or 3 papers in energy economics, and that mainly was I studied the energy transition in Saudi Arabia across the electricity sector, the transport sector, and the petrochemical sector. So basically, I was using the tools that I got from the IAEA to study to explore new avenues for energy transition in the region. We're looking really into the role of clean fossil fuels technologies, because at the IAEA, they used to look at the role of nuclear energy. While when I was at KSA, I used the same tool to look at what's the roles of carbon capture, hydrogen, alternative sources of fuels, and how they can transform the energy sector of the kingdom and achieve the kingdom's, let's say, climate targets, which have now been announced recently back in October and November by the Crown Prince during the COP26 conference. Then I've decided to go back to Austria. So being at KSA is a science and technology university, all labs, so 90% of people working at KSA, if not 100%, are in the labs. So I decided to go back to Austria, to the University of Vienna. So I got a generous fellowship from King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. And I would say that because when I was at the IAEA, I developed links with King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies because they do research related to energy security. So they were, let's say, happy enough to sponsor me, and they gave me very basic fellowship. It wasn't that high. It was equivalent to something like £10,000, that is 60,000 Saudi riyals. So just for 6 months. But that fellowship enabled me to stay in Austria for 3 years, because after that fellowship, every sponsor came to sponsor me in Austria, because you achieved something with sponsored by King Faisal Center. And then I stayed until 3 years continuing. Even the Austrian government have sponsored me in the last 6 months of my time in Austria. So after spending 3 years in Austria, of which 6 months were at OPEC, I started C Markets in London, and now I spend my time. I'm also a member of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, where we advise countries on better use of clean fossil fuels, mainly the European region. And more recently, I got rehired back at Imperial College as an honorary research fellow. So essentially now the research that I do is also associated with Imperial College. So the last photo there, you see the outgoing Secretary General of OPEC, Mr. Barkindo. If you heard that, he's leaving now. And the guy there also Mr. Bob Dudley, the former CEO of BP, who led the company since the accident of the Gulf of Mexico. So most of these meetings actually were in Vienna. So now moving ahead, so what I'm going to talk about today. Now let's go to the technical talks. If we look at what I'm going to discuss here, guys, is the future of oil demand and the developments in oil markets and the need for more investments. I'll focus on these four topics. And then the last, I'll finish with our forecast for the year 2022. After that, in the discussion, I have some more slides to speak about energy transition in Saudi Arabia, but I would like to discuss them during the Q&A. So, if we look at the future of oil demand, the latest world oil outlook, if you follow OPEC data, there is a very important publication annually published by OPEC, which is called World Oil Outlook. And what it shows you annually is that what would be the future oil demand going from now until 2040 and even beyond. So the latest publication shows that the oil demand will reach 108 million barrels by the year 2045. So comparing this to the 2019 level, there is something like an 8 million barrels extra demand that will be needed by the year 2045. And most of that demand will actually be fueled by the petrochemical sectors. There is an expected peak in oil demand in the transport sector by the year 2030, and that is mainly due to the expected high penetration of EVs, and especially coming from the OECD countries. In fact, the oil demand in the OECD countries have already peaked, and now we are talking about India, China, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, where most oil demand is actually expected to come over the next 20 years. So now looking at what BP thinks. BP have published 3 main scenarios last year in 2020, and many of these scenarios were actually controversial because they said if we are going to achieve the net zero targets, perhaps oil demand is expected to peak within the next 4 years, and then it will drop to something like 25 million barrels by the year 2050. That is if the world is going to achieve its net zero targets. And that is, when we say net zero targets, that means what you emit is when what you absorb from the air gives you zero. So, and that is mainly expected to be related to how the clean transition will happen. So that means there needs to be a major transformation in the energy sector, talking about the electricity sector, the transport sector, and also the industrial sector. And this is, let's say, the most stringent scenarios, but looking at more possible scenarios is that oil demand is expected to be above 80 million barrels. And that assumes that there will be a peak oil demand, but still we are not achieving the net zero targets. So, this is what let's say the most important forecasters thinks about the future of oil demand. Looking now what would be the role of oil suppliers, and if we look at supplies between 1960s until this year, we find that oil supplies has been rising, and in fact it has been the major driver for the world's economy. So looking at the world economy back in 1960s until the year 2020, it has from less than $1 trillion, now it is almost $84 trillion. And one of the most important, let's say, drivers for that is OPEC policies, followed then OPEC plus policies. If we look at the market share of OPEC, it used to be something like 50% back in between the 60s until the 75. But since then, since the 70s, the market share of OPEC has shrunk due to major reasons, and one of these major reasons was the development of non-OPEC supplies. And perhaps you are a petroleum engineer, so you know shale oil, which has developed really back in after 2010. But before the shale oil, we had developments of the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, that was all done in the 80s and the 90s. And that's why the market share of OPEC shrunk to 30%, and it has stayed 30% until today. So, looking at now, there has been major events that happened when moving. In fact, these are similar graphs, but the major events that have affected supply and demand includes the first oil crisis that happened back in the 75, which led to a major global recession at the beginning of the 70s, and also the second oil crisis, which happened in the between 1979 and 1980. In fact, there was no shortage of oil because the oil shrunk, or the oil supply shrunk by only 4%. But the Iranian Revolution back in the 1970s and the 80s has sent a signal to the oil market, sending oil prices 100%, double the price. So the price was $20 and it went to almost $40. $40 back in the 80s is something like $120 in today's monetary value, if we will take the adjusted inflation. And then we had the Gulf War and the Iraq invasion, global recession, different events that have all led to a major impact into how we see oil markets today. And I'm going to elaborate more on that in the next slide. Until we saw the OPEC Plus Accord in 2016, I'm lucky enough to have witnessed that accord, so I can speak better on that since 2013 because I've seen all these events compared to events that happened back in the 80s and the 90s, which I have not attended. So, and then as we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic, which has got an impact that even was worse than the impact of the global recession, because in global recession we had the world economy shrinking to 1.3%, minus 1.3%, but the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a world, or the economic decline, the world economy declined to minus 3.6%. So looking now at the oil prices, I'm sure you all, that's what companies' CEOs will be mainly concerned about. So looking at since 1983 and the Iraq, this was, let's say, the second oil crisis was beginning of the 1983, and that was during the Iraq-Iran war. And after that war, we had a major decline in the prices because at that time there has been a change in Saudi Arabia policy, which has led to decreasing supplies, all right, and then re-increasing supplies to about 9 million barrels. And that has led oil prices to decline back in the end of the 80s. And then they have stayed almost stable since towards the end of the 80s until the 90s. And I believe since we had even the Asian financial crisis had let's say a limited impact on oil markets, but really since let's say after 2008, after the year 2000s, with the rise of China, the rise in China has sent a signal that oil prices will rise. And because we have lived in an era in the 90s where has been a major decline in the investments, because oil prices were relatively low. So that has sent prices skyrocketing to more than $140 in 2008. And that was a major driver of the world's economic recession later, sending oil prices to $34 the year later. Then we have seen this was also sent another signal to the markets, because that means there's just a paper published recently saying that since the global recession back in 2008, 2009, the markets has seen much and less equilibrium compared to where they were before the global recession. Although volatility is still high, didn't change much, but the market's equilibrium is much less compared to the era before the global recession. So then we have seen the year of 2011, 2014. That is, of course, perhaps you remember that when the Arab Spring happened, Libya, the Libyan civil war, which removed 3 million barrels from the markets, and that has been a major driver why we were seeing prices trading above $100 for almost 4 years. What did that mean? That has sent a lot of cash to oil companies, which has led to the so-called US shale oil boom during the Obama period. So during the US shale oil boom, there has been two decisions for OPEC, either to bring back supplies and allow shale oil to grow, or to keep pumping and remove the expensive supplies from the markets. And they take the second decision, which has sent prices down back in 2014. I remember I was at that meeting. And then we've seen prices the next year going to below $30 for WTI. I'm sure you all remember that period. And then in 2016, we have seen one of the most important events in oil market, which was the formation of OPEC+, which is essentially an alliance between OPEC, Russia, and former Soviet Union countries, and of course, and other countries, which they all have agreed to cut production by about 1 million barrels. And this it didn't just fix prices, but it also removed more than 100 million barrels of stocks in the United States. So while the US oil stocks were about 560 million barrels, all right, within the period of 2015, after the formation of OPEC+, the stocks in the United States fell to about 440 million barrels. So, and then of course, OPEC+ has done a fantastic job since 2016 until we came to 2020 last year. The year before last year. Now we are in 2022. I still need to believe that. We are in 2022. So we are in 2022, all right? So in 2020, which was a real test for the alliance, because it was March, and you all remember when the group did not agree, because Russia was insisting that there is no need to cut, and OPEC countries were all trying to reach an agreement. And Russia decided to keep pumping. So all suppliers decided to pump at their maximum capacity. And this was actually the worst April. They call it Black April for the oil industry, because they have never seen a collapse in oil prices as the April 2020. So, and after that, President Trump has interfered to find a deal between OPEC and Russia, and mainly, and perhaps you have all seen that in the news, which has been the most important agreement in the oil market sector since the establishment of OPEC in the 1960s, because we have never seen an agreement between OPEC and non-OPEC suppliers as lengthy as the recent OPEC+ agreement, which lasts for more than 2 years. So now we have an agreement lasting until September 2022, this year. And in fact, it's even officially, it is until December. And in fact, it can even last even beyond than that. So I believe this has given the market stability that we have not seen before the year 2020. Of course, vaccines have got a major role to play here. OPEC has cut production, but without the discovery of vaccines, we wouldn't have seen the world economy coming back on its to come back working. Otherwise, we could have still been in a period of low supplies, because if you remember, there has been something like 30 million barrels of oil being removed from global demand, and supplies shrunk to something like 70 million barrels, and now they are back to almost above 99 million barrels. So if we look at, I've spoken in much details about what I wanted to say, but this graph just zoom into the year 2019 and 2020, which really shows you here one important event happened, which was WTI going into negative territory. And one of the most reasons for that was there was not enough storage. And financial traders, they had no way to use that oil because it was on a delivery date. So what to do with that? They just decided to pay someone to take these contracts instead of having that oil, because they were just running out of storage. And that was, again, due to, let's say, the incremental supplies that happened back in March 2020. And last year in 2021, when we had major events happening, and I would like just to zoom into that because it is the latest events. So starting from Saudi Arabia announcing 1 million barrels voluntary cuts. This was really a major factor to the markets, because it has supported let's say, the market balance to happen much, much faster. Because you all know that some OPEC producers fall below their production strategies. And without the voluntary cuts coming from Saudi Arabia, I would think that it could have taken much longer for the oil market to rebalance itself. Of course, we have seen that some major back in the summer when OPEC and UAE did not agree on a deal. And of course, still this is something of a high uncertainty on the production baselines of different OPEC producers as different countries continue to invest in their production capacity. And this is really happening in the Gulf region and perhaps even Iraq. Also, the COP26 negotiations, which somehow are of a concern because during the climate negotiations, what does that mean? It means there could be a shortage of investments going into the oil and gas sector, and that can set a bullish signal to the markets because traders then factor the fact that there will be no more oil discoveries, and then that could send the prices a bit up over the next years. So even Omicron, the latest report from OPEC shows that it's a short-lived virus. We all hope that we don't see any new forms of COVID-19 variants this year. So that was really the major driver why we're seeing now prices trading about $80, back again to $80. So going now again, this is a very most interesting graphs I like to see because what it shows you is the United States continues to play a major role on oil markets, whether it's their production policy, or even how the oil price itself moves, because at the end of the day, it's the dollar. Yes, the physical suppliers, they have a very strong roles, but also how the policies coming from the Federal Reserve are of paramount importance on how the oil prices will move. And here I like to see that because since 1987, since Ronald Reagan period, we have seen here the United States production was something like 18.14 million barrels. And then it started to decline as we move till the Bush era, the Clinton and the George W. Bush era, the production of the United States has been going down. And why is that? The reason is, as I showed you in the previous graph, oil prices were low. And the United States did not have enough oil to explore. And what does that mean? Even President Bush, George W. Bush said it once, America is addicted to oil. And there has been a much increase on demand for foreign oil during Bush era compared to any other US president. And it was since the global recession, when oil prices rebounded to above $100, it was Obama's period which has led to the development of the US shale oil boom. And of course, Trump reaped the rewards of Obama's policy, because during the Trump period, the United States production was the highest in the history, 13 million barrels of oil a day. And the United States was declared energy independent. Of course, now it's Biden, and of course, what the shaded area shows you is the number of US oil rigs. So whenever we see oil prices going up, the number of US oil rigs continue to go up. This is the conventional trend. But since Biden came into power, this is not the case anymore, because Biden is putting a lot of policies on US oil producers. He is not incentivizing national production, and instead he is asking for foreign supplies. And you've all seen the news that he has asked OPEC Plus to supply more than 400,000 barrels just in the end of last year, and his request wasn't even delivered. But there were two presidents who thanked OPEC Plus in the history of the United States presidential, who were Biden and Trump, because Trump has thanked OPEC Plus since signing the historical agreements, and just this month, after OPEC Plus met earlier in January, he also thanked OPEC Plus for agreeing to pump 400,000 barrels. So it shows you that there is a change in the US administration, how they deal with OPEC and OPEC Plus suppliers. So what I would like to to emphasize here is there is a need for investments. And if you look at the recent data from the IEF, in 2015, the level of investment is still below $500 billion. And it needs to be at least $523 billion over the next 10 years. In fact, there is something like $4.7 trillion that needs to be invested over the next decade in order to meet a growing demand for oil, which was forecast to be 108 million barrels by the year 2045. And if we do not deliver that, as our energy minister, Prince Abdulaziz, said, he's expecting an energy crisis over the next decade if we do not deliver these targeted investments over the next years. Of course, in 2023, this is an expected figure, not the real figure. But if you look at the previous year, there is always a shortage, especially in 2020, which was the COVID-19 period. So, and just look at the gas markets. It gives you an excellent, a perfect model onto what an energy crisis, how an energy crisis can happen. 2018, 2020, gas prices have always been low. And in Europe, they did not invest much in their gas resources. They have put all of their investments in renewables. And when the wind did not blow just last year, what did that lead to? There has been very much switch to gas, and there was not enough stocks, which has sent gas prices skyrocketing to more than 440% incremental rise. And another reason is that Europe is dependent on virtually a single supplier, which is Russia. And they are not making it easy for Russia to supply gas with the restrictions putting on the Nord Stream 2 project, especially the German government. And that means gas price, of course, there has been more switching from gas to oil to supply electricity, something that did not happen in the past 20 years. In the electricity sector, there has always been a switch from oil to gas or coal. But the way back, this only happened during the recent gas crisis. So I believe it sends a lesson on what can happen to oil markets if the oil industry continues to be underinvested. Another important consideration here is even OPEC Plus itself is unable to supply all what it's trying to provide. And the reason for that is there is a shortage of investments mainly in Africa. So the gap between what the group wants to supply and what they are actually supplying is expected to be 2 million barrels by the end of this year, in September, Q3 this year. And that is mainly, if you look at Nigeria and Angola, the largest suppliers in Africa. And just look at their compliance, 275. It should be 100, not 275 or 277. And there's more than 500,000 barrels of oil shortage from these key suppliers in Africa. In fact, all the others also matter, but these are the two largest oil suppliers in the OPEC group. I also see Azerbaijan. Also, one important is Malaysia. So all these countries continue to suffer from underinvestment. And I believe what could that mean is that possibly we are into a period of higher prices, not just because of shortage of investment, but also because OPEC Plus is unable to supply what could be in demand in 2020 and beyond. So just these are some of the bullish and bearish factors that we can see this year. I'm not putting our figures for prices in 2021 and 2022, but this just shows you our forecast in 2020. We were expecting prices in 2020 to hit $50 beginning of the year, and that's something really happened. But what could we have to watch for this year is continued switching to oil from gas, so the gas market, and OPEC Plus, their efficiency of supplies. Are they able to supply what they have promised for, especially the African suppliers? And of course, COVID-19, Omicron and possibly some other new forms of the variant, especially in countries which continue to encounter low vaccination rates. These are the countries that are expected to send new variants to the world. Complicated geopolitics. Now we have two major geopolitical events this year that we have to watch for. Not just talking about the United States-Iran negotiations currently happening in Vienna. If there is no deal between Iran and the US, what could happen as a result of that? And also, another factor is how the US is dealing with Russia. Now Russia is trapping some troops near the Ukrainian borders. If there is any military intervention between Russia and Ukraine, what could that lead to? And Russia is a major member of OPEC Plus alliance. Of course, these are the bullish signals, the factors that we have to watch for that could send prices up, because Russia is a major supplier of OPEC Plus, and also if there is no deal between the Western powers and Iran, that can also be another factor that can lead to a bullish signal. On the other hand, the factors that we think can send the prices down is possibly new forms of COVID-19, restricted mobility, maybe not now, but maybe in end of 2022. All right, certainly I'm not expecting anything in the summer, because usually in the summer, viruses, as medics say, they get weaker, and but towards the end of 2022, perhaps we could see some new forms of the COVID-19 story. More coordinated SPRs, and if you all have heard that the White House announcing 50 million barrels of SPRs release just last year. Certainly they did nothing to the markets. When there is a friend of mine who used to work for the White House. His name is Bob McNally. Maybe you've heard about him. And he described the SPRs as kind of a water gun. So when he was asked by CNN, what do you think about the action of the SPRs? He said, it's like you're going to the battle with a water gun. So they did nothing. But possibly there could be more, let's say, of that policy on SPRs. But in my view, they will only compromise the energy security of their country. But to the markets, they will do nothing. So a rapid return of OPEC exempted members, Libya, Venezuela, or possibly even a return of Iranian production, although many analysts say that Iran is already smuggling oil, but I still think that when Iran can officially sell oil, that will be a different story, because they can sell to everybody. It will certainly have a weight on the markets. So these are just our brief outlook for this year. That's all what I wanted to discuss with you. The next slide for energy transition, I would like to leave it for our Q&A discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yousef. This is a very informative presentation and definitely inspiring صراحة career. So the format of this discussion is going to be a roundtable discussion. MashaAllah, during your presentation, you covered a lot of the topics that I wanted to discuss. So basically, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. I'll try to call your name to ask it. Just introduce yourself, and then we'll have Doctor to answer it. So Doctor, you've talked about many factors of uncertainty in the markets of oil. Certainly, when we talk about some major producing countries coming back, like Venezuela, Iran, and also at the other side, we have some countries not being able to meet their production, like the African countries, like Kazakhstan, for the political tension over there. So, Doctor, taking all of those factors into consideration, would we see prices go above $100?
Well, I can't exclude that possibility, but I think $100, to think about $100 at this stage is too early. And I said it to Forbes just a few days ago. Why? Because possibly we could see $90 in the summer. But I still think that if, here, because I believe always politics play a role in here. So I think possibly OPEC will pump more oil if prices continue to go above $90, preventing them from going to $100. But at this stage, I don't think we can see $100 in 2022. But certainly, $90 is a possibility if there's continued shortage of supplies and COVID-19 or Omicron, or there's no impact on the world economy, the activities of the world economy in 2022. Certainly, it's a possibility by the summer.
Great, Doctor. When we talk about oil prices, there is always a talk about the fair price versus the sustainable price. Some people really talk about the fair price, and there is some sort of a range where the prices are more of fair for everyone. And when His Royal Highness, the Minister of Energy, was asked about that, he talked, and there is no such thing as a fair price. Instead, we adopt the concept of sustainable price. What would be the range of a sustainable price that will enable major producing companies to sustain their production and to maintain the production for years to come, to ensure the security of the energy sector, and at the same time it would be affordable for everyone?
I think it's a big subject, because if you ask different producers about what price they like to see the markets, if you ask OPEC, it will be a different price than if you ask the US suppliers, or if you ask the North Sea suppliers, or the Norwegian. I think everybody would want to see a price that bring them back some profits. For OPEC, prices have changed. We have not seen really a fixed price that the group will agree on, because even among OPEC itself, different countries have got different price setting that they need to. If you ask the government, it's different from you ask the company, because when the government comes to work out their break even, they take into account the national budget. But companies, they look at their company's profitability. If you ask Aramco, they can live with $20. They can still be in business. If you ask BP, they would need a $40 at least. So let's look at it this way. But in my view, a price that is fair for oil to keep all suppliers happy in the market, to keep, let's say, even the financial markets healthy and in good condition, to continue, and we continue to see investments in the upstream industry. I think we need to see a price that no less than $60, around $60, a price that is not high enough to prevent the world economic activity, especially in Asia. All right, so if prices go above $90, our Asian consumers won't be happy. All right, if you've all seen the Indian energy minister when he thought 60 is high. So everyone would look at it from their perspective. Yes, but I think at least between $60 to $80, that's a reasonable range. Between 60 and 70 is kind of the medium for under these conditions. Because why I say $70? Because $70, I think we can supply investments into the industry, so to keep growing demand for oil in the next few decades. Also, it doesn't certainly provide any economic hurdle for the world economy when we are on the $70. And perhaps even the United States, US consumers is a major factor in here. If you look at recent calls of President Biden, they have all been influenced by not the oil industry, but by the consumers, the people who pay for fuel at the gas station. These are the people who influenced his policies. So, and I believe that's what we really need to take into account. So I believe, in my view, $70 is a sustainable price for the meantime. Yeah,
great. Doctor, you talked about the investments in the oil and gas and how it's basically shrinking. Today, we're witnessing some sort of an increase in the oil demand. And also, we're seeing some sort of, I would say, a shrink or a limitation in the spare capacity of OPEC as the demand is increasing. And yet, at the second part of the equation, the investments are still not enough. And it's going down, it's declining.
Yes. Why is that?
for the future of the security of the energy industry? Yes. How the implications?
Because of politics. Investments aren't going down because there's not money. There is money, but it's politics. We are making it harder for fossil fuels to produce, for fossil companies to produce. Banks aren't giving loans to upstream projects as much as before, and that is why we continue to see underinvestments in the oil and gas sector. Now, if you look at the US, the oil price is high, but the activities in the US oil drilling isn't rising. Not because they don't have money, they've got money, but the politics being made by the current US administration is making it harder for them to invest. So they see a less economic incentive to invest in in fossil fuels compared to just increasing the returns on their shareholders. And this is a major reason. So I believe, number one, we need to do policy reforms. Our international energy policies need a major reform in order for us to continue to see investments catching up with their levels. But I believe there is cash in the industry. So here I'd like just to praise Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is the world's largest investor in the upstream sector. So you wouldn't see any company in the world putting as much investments in the upstream sector as Saudi Aramco. So I believe this is an important model for other companies worldwide to continue to invest. And there has been major criticism from the international media when Aramco announced that their targets to produce 13 million barrels by 2027. But despite that, I believe all those who criticize the company will come back, will one day come back and say, oh, they did the right thing. When they see that other producers are not able to keep with demand and only a single company have taken the right decision, despite all this international pressure on climate change and other green agenda.
Excellent. Dr. Since we're talking about the prices and the investments, taking into consideration the increase in capex because of the complexity in the type of investments you need in order to develop your fields. Yani basically, we reached a high level of maturity for many countries, which takes a bigger investment to maintain the production capacity. And on the other hand, you have the emerging unconventional plays, which basically takes a much bigger investments to have it up running. And then you have the ambitious plans of achieving a net zero, which also takes another big chunk of investments. With all of that in mind, and also when you consider the policies in place, which basically needs companies to have a bigger capital investment to adhere to those policies. With all of those factors in mind, is it a good rationale for companies to shy away from the oil and gas and head to another industry?
No, because we don't have the technologies that we have today aren't ready enough to replace oil and gas, even for the next 10 years. So, but we need to find a cleaner way of using oil and gas. It doesn't mean, one important thing is energy efficiency and removing carbon. We need to find ways of utilizing carbon. So I believe if we invest in these two trends, certainly oil we can just continue to use oil while not compromising any environmental issues over the next 20 years at least. But the risk here is moving far too fast, and that's what happened in the gas markets. Because in Europe, they were far too ambitious to replace all their power supplies with renewables, and they were going away from nuclear and coal. Okay, so see what happened when renewables aren't ready to replace fossil. And because of the strong environmental opposition against nuclear, now Germany is thinking to operate many of their nuclear power units. Although despite a strong environmental opposition there. France is already doing well on nuclear. That's why they were in a much better situation compared to Netherlands or Germany. So I believe we can't move too fast. We need to move at a pace. There will always be energy transition. Before oil, it was coal. And certainly they will, as maybe late Minister Yamani said, the Stone Age didn't end because of lack of a stone, and the oil age will end far before the world runs out of oil. So I tend to agree with that statement. So I think there will be energy transition, but there will be a role for oil. And I think the role that oil will play in the future will be different from what we're seeing today. Because now we see oil maybe going towards cars, combustion, but perhaps we're going to see a different utilization of oil as we move in the years ahead. Still, it's a useful chemical commodity. An EV, an electric vehicle, is perhaps maybe 90% made of oil parts. So just tell an EV manufacturer, don't be too happy, because even if you don't put us in your tank, we still make you. It's made of oil, but still, EV manufacturers just sometimes fail to understand that. So I believe the utilization of oil in the future could be different from what we see it today.
Before Doctor, we kind of shift gears to talk about sustainability and sustainability efforts and how it's basically going to transform the shape of industry. I'd like to hear your view on the unconventional plays. We have ambitious plans here in Saudi Arabia. We heard about Al Jafura.
Yeah, of course.
How it's going to basically contribute to the security of the energy industry, and would it give Saudi Arabia a bigger leverage in at least have a bigger spare capacity?
Well, to my knowledge, Al Jafura is a $100 billion investment, more than 100, almost $110 billion investments over the next 10 years. And it should enable the kingdom to replace all oil combustion and power generation with gas. So essentially, we won't need to use oil anymore, especially when it comes to water desalination or power generation, and of course other key. It will also supply other key petrochemical sectors. And I've also heard that it will supply the hydrogen project, because Saudi Arabia plans to. Here, what I wanted to show. Oh, the slides are gone. Okay. Saudi Arabia is planning to produce 4 million tons of blue hydrogen, blue and green, by 2030. So a major part of that will be blue, which comes from hydrocarbons. And I believe Al Jafura is one will be a feedstock, will provide the gas feedstock. But I also believe that if we also need to be a major player in hydrogen, we need to use oil, because we've got a lot of heavy oil in Saudi. So if we can develop new technologies to use oil directly via what they call gasification into hydrogen, that will be a much better way to produce hydrogen, and also to use far less energy compared to using natural gas. So that is how I think our future in terms of hydrogen will be. In terms of the shale oil or the unconventionals, yes, I believe it will provide us with feedstock, mainly going towards electricity and water desalination.
Great. Doctor, we talked a lot about the role of OPEC and OPEC Plus, especially amid the pandemic, and how it's basically steered the energy market toward the shores of safety. Now, some think that the biggest gains of COVID-19 is the harmony we've seen OPEC Plus operate, especially after they've reached the historical agreement with Russia. Do you think this sort of harmony would last for a much longer? Do you think that they will continue to operate together in
Yes. Well, I think the politics of OPEC Plus is working very well over the past, since 2020. What 2020 did, yes, there was an agreement, there was a break, but coming back into agreement showed that this alliance is far more stronger compared to what it was perceived before 2020. And Prince Abdulaziz said it many times, and he was asked once by a Russian TV, and they asked him what was the most challenging time, I think they said to him, or situation you faced, and he said the time we didn't agree in Vienna in 2020. And he said, but that in agreement made us much more stronger compared to the time before. So I think the politics is working very well now for the meantime, even for the foreseeable future, I would say for the next 5 years for OPEC+. The Russians are happy with it, but here one thing I'm certainly not worried about the politics within OPEC+, but I'm worried about how Russia deals with Europe and the US. This is different, and this is a factor of uncertainty that we have to watch for.
Great, Doctor. Let's talk about sustainability. A lot of talk has been going on about the sustainability and its effect on the energy market. We've heard about the ambitious announcements, the Green Saudi announcement, the Green Middle East announcement. How it's going to play a role in the energy? Would it change the way it looks today? The oil and gas, basically, industry and the energy market at large?
The Green Initiative, I think it's a good initiative pledged by the Kingdom, because we are the world's largest exporter. So we have to provide some initiatives to climate change and the world's environmental, initiatives. So I believe that Green Initiative is expected to reduce carbon emissions by something like 4% from the business as usual trends. And certainly when you plant trees, what does that mean? It means you remove CO2 from other combustion or hydrocarbon utilization activities. So I think if other countries, certainly it is on the Middle Eastern level, but if there is a global international initiative, as the Green Initiative now being pledged by Saudi Arabia, it will play a role towards achieving net zero. Because it means that for every carbon you put into the atmosphere, it gets removed. So, and I believe Saudi Arabia is pledging something like 278 million ton reduction by 2026. 20, to become net zero by 2060, but by 2030 we will reduce our emissions by 278 million ton.
That's right. His Royal Highness, when he used to talk about the sustainability, he always talked about three main pillars when talking about the importance of sustainability. He said that we can't overlook one of the pillars at the expense of the others. The first one is basically the economic growth. The second one is the security of energy market, and the third is the well-being of people. And those there has to be some sort of a balance between them. Is there a way to address those challenges or pillars in a very balanced way?
Can you just restate that?
Basically, you have three concerns. First one is the energy security. Second one is the economic growth, and you want to enable it for as many countries as possible. And the third one, which basically any initiatives of climate change comes under it, is the well-being of people.
That's just let's say, the energy policy trilemma. That's the angle of energy policies, how energy policies will have to devise to make their policies. And I believe he has picked up the right important factors, which environment, security, and economic well-being. So very rarely you can find countries that can achieve or satisfy all these factors. And I believe the oil industry needs to always, or let's say, envisage these three factors when devising the future policies or the future of the energy or the oil sector itself. So, especially when talking about the green agenda, because there is yes, oil can give you access, perhaps, can create jobs, but enhancing the environmental aspect here is crucial. But perhaps other forms of industries will not achieve or they will not give you the same economic incentives as the oil industry will do. And I believe here this is there is by the way, a report that gets published by World Energy Council every year called World Energy Trilemma that ranks countries based on the sustainable energy policy. So they look at the environment, access, and security. So, and I believe here what really any policymakers need to look at when. So I think yes, he has picked up the right and most important factors.
Is there a room for a balanced, I'd say, approach to tackle those issues together?
So essentially, you need just to try and achieve all that. It depends certainly where you are. For example, talking here about Saudi Arabia, certainly the oil sector continues to be an important role in the GDP. Although there is a growth in the non-oil sector by something like 30%, which is excellent. But still oil continues to be, let's say, the main supporter for even our credit rating, international credit rating. But I think we need to enhance our profile in the environmental aspects. And I think that's there's been really the recent driver of environmental initiatives, whether it's being announced by the Kingdom or Aramco or SABIC. So I think the environmental aspects, that's what really need to work on within the next 10 years. And any environmental initiative needs to add into the economic benefits. For instance, when you capture CO2 from the environment, you pay into that because you want to perhaps not pollute keep emitting carbon to control the Earth's temperature or whatever, but you can create jobs out of that. You're creating a whole new industry. So I think this is what policymakers need to think of. With any environmental initiatives, there needs to be an economic incentive out of it, and that economic incentive can be creation of jobs, or even support. There could be also what's called moral incentives. So yes, that's I think how we need to really
to look at it as an opportunity instead of a challenge. That's great. Now we'd like to hear from the audience if anyone has any questions. Please go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so my name is Yousef. I'm a petroleum engineer with Saudi Aramco.
Okay.
And I'd like to thank you for this interesting topic.
My pleasure.
My question for you has to do with net zero specifically. As you know from like COP21 with the Paris Agreement, all the way looking at COP26, specifically policies relating to that, and looking at current technologies such as carbon capture and current breakthroughs in gasification with membrane solutions, steam methane reforming, and hydrogen fuel cells. Is it realistic to assume that we globally will be able to meet a net zero target?
Yeah, there is. If you ask the IAEA, there is no reason why not. But the risk is here. We are too late.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a possibility of meeting net zero. But here, there is also one big challenge, which is energy poverty. And that's why you have seen countries in COP26 trying to change the narrative of coal from phasing out to phasing down. What's the reason for that is they have people who need electricity, while perhaps in Europe that's not an issue. So, and I think here that is the main challenge for achieving net zero. It is possible to achieve net zero, but there needs to be energy for everyone on the planet, especially in emerging economies. That will be India, Southeast Asia, Africa, or other countries. We have the technologies available, but we need also to do more investments. We need policy reforms and regulations in place. We need a global agreement on carbon price. COP26, there has been a major achievement on in principle, there is an agreement that there will be a carbon price, but what carbon price will be and from region to one region, that's what we really need to work on in the next climate conferences. But at least now there is in principle an agreement that all countries will adapt to CO2 price. Even here in Saudi Arabia, there is a voluntary carbon market to be launched by the Public Investment Fund, I believe later. So my answer is yes, but there are challenges, but it is not impossible, and I'm worried that we are too late.
Wow, that's concerning.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Reem, for a great question. Go ahead.
My name is Abdurrahman Hamdan. I work living at Roundtable in Saudi Arabia.
Welcome.
I have a question regarding, as you mentioned, that we are lacking investment in oil industry, and on the other hand, we seem to see renewable energy to have more attraction in terms of investment. Could this be why we are having less investment in oil industry as a political pressure?
Mohammed, right?
Abdurrahman.
I think your question was why we don't have investments in the upstream, right?
Could it be political?
Yeah, as I said, the regulations are making it tougher and tougher for oil companies to invest. I wouldn't say here in Saudi, but in Europe, the US, as I just showed in one of the graphs, they're now with the prices of oil exceeding $80, but the investment, especially at the IAEA level, International Oil Companies level, there is one major challenge is that shareholders of IOCs, international oil companies, are becoming more and more concerned about climate, and they're putting pressure on the company's management. Look at what BP announced back in 2020, that they're going to be net zero by 2050, I think. And when you have more companies going that direction, by the way, now I think most oil companies are pledging net zero except for Chevron and Exxon, let's say the top five majors. Shell announced, Total and BP, but Chevron and ExxonMobil still they are in the oil age. That makes it why we have shortages of investments, and that can be a risk over the next 10 years, at least 10 years, I would say. All right, so I think we need a policy reform. Certainly here, politics affects economics. Yeah, and if we continue to see more stringent policies, I believe, as Prince Abdulaziz said once, we could end up in an energy crisis over the next 10 years. I tend to agree with that statement. Yeah, so I think yes.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. Please go ahead.
Hey, Saeed here. How are you doing?
Hi, Saeed.
Yes.
He was with me in Nottingham.
Oh, mashallah.
The question is, you've talked about the politics. What about China? You've never mentioned about China, Taiwan politics.
Well, I did mention that most of the oil demand growth will come from China. Yeah, so China, India will drive the growth in demand. But it's a consumer in the end. China is not the supplier. So, what was your question exactly?
The question was how China-US relations keep changing.
Yeah.
Would that be a factor in oil prices?
Yeah, of course. I think now we're slightly better compared to Trump era. During President Trump, you remember back in 2000, I think 18 or 19, we have seen a retreat in prices when there has been a rising tension between the US and China. I think now the situation is much better. So it's if we see the world economy or the economic data coming from China, they continue to be strong for at least the end of 2021. Then we have seen a slightly slowdown due to the real estate crisis and some other activities going on there. And now Omicron, they've done some lockdowns in some restricted regions, but economic figures in China continue to be the major driver and demand for at least for this year and in 2021 certainly, and now in 2022. But certainly China is a major importer of OPEC crude. They also take crude from Russia. Just the latest figures coming from China, they imported 1.8 million barrels from Saudi Arabia. And if you compare that, this I think has been their highest figure. Certainly Saudi Arabia has been the largest supplier. If you compare that to the year before, 2020, they got something like 2 million barrels. 14 million barrels their total imports. So I think the economic figures coming from China will be an important factor over the next 20 years.
Excellent. Thank you. More questions?
So, she was my student at PMU.
Zahra.
Feel free to ask if you want. Feel free to ask if you would like to.
طيب دكتور, يعني we had a lot of or some questions talking about the sustainability. Would it pose a threat on oil and gas market in the future?
Sustainability.
Alternative energy resources.
Well, I think coming back to what I mentioned is if we move too fast, we will be in a risk, not a threat. Because I still believe that we cannot replace our conventional energy sources with alternatives, which I mean here renewables. There is a statement for Putin. He says that he describes renewables as peanuts. Oil and gas as the main dish.
The beat.
And renewables is the peanuts. So, did I mention that at PMU one day? Maybe I didn't. I mentioned it to dispatch. So I tend to agree with Putin's statements. Renewables is the peanuts. So you cannot replace your energy system with renewables. You need the backup. And that backup will come either from fossil or nuclear. Even, by the way, if you replace it with EVs, even if we now have all these cars are EVs, there needs to be an electricity supply, and that electricity will come either from fossil or nuclear. So if they don't think of nuclear, and if they decide to go 100% to nuclear, then the security risk will rise. And I was working at the IAEA before, and I know how sensitive nuclear policies are. Maybe in Europe, they'd have no problems putting a nuclear reactor, but other countries, when you have every country having a nuclear reactor, it becomes a security risk. And that's why it's very complex.
Especially with the density of population in some countries, yeah.
Absolutely, because going into nuclear energy, you need to sign a lot of agreements. Just look at how different countries, what they had to do just to put a nuclear unit in there. And of course, access to capital, talent, and other infrastructure. It's not easy to go nuclear. So I think fossils will remain with us. So I don't see that there's a threat. Yeah, but I think there is a risk if we continue to invest far too little in upstream on the fossil, and we put all of our money in the renewables, and at the end of the day, these renewables won't work, and then we have an energy crisis.
Forgive me, doctor, but I'm a petroleum engineer. Dr. Saudi Arabia have given a different approach toward addressing the challenge of climate change. The model Saudi Arabia have presented is basically to continue investing in oil and gas, and yet incorporating more of a clean policies and more of a cleaner methods, basically trying to clean whatever you're consuming. Would this model change the perception of the oil and gas as I'd say one of the sources of climate change? And would we see this model being adopted elsewhere? I mean, oil and gas and alternative resources working in harmony.
First, I'm against the idea that oil and gas is the source for climate change. Climate change really is because of coal. China, United States, and Europe, they have emitted most of the carbon because of their coal power generation since the Industrial Revolution, which have left us into what we are now. Oil mainly goes to transport, and transport is no more than 0.25% of global CO2 emissions. So, although you may argue with me that gas emissions and methane stays in the atmosphere, but still the largest contribution towards climate change really came from coal and from the industrial emitters, not even in the developing countries. All right. Certainly now China is one big emitter, and that's, by the way, geopolitics play an important role. Perhaps that's why now the U.S. is trying to pressure China economically, and with this climate change issue, so that they do not achieve the same industrial level as the West has already achieved. So I'm against putting all the blame on oil and gas, because it would be without oil, we wouldn't have reached to the level of industrialization that the world is currently enjoying. I like one statement said by Abdullah Jum'ah once, that he said, when I see students going to school every morning, and I know that the bus that they use, the fuel that is coming from my industry, I feel happy. And when I see children or infants in the hospitals, and I know that this electricity is coming from my industry, I feel happy. So I'm against putting all the blame on oil, because oil, in fact, this has led, and I showed you the first graph. Without oil, we wouldn't see the world economy growing to what it is now, although the trend is changing. So, second part of the question?
Sorry.
You said putting all the blame.
I was saying that this model that Saudi Arabia have adapted.
Yeah. So it's going to change, certainly. What the kingdom is doing now is amazing.
Kind of a moderate.
Yeah, certainly. If you just look at the international media, how they what gets written by experts and professionals about what's happening in the kingdoms as a part of the 2030 vision. Certainly, it's incredible, and I believe other countries should also follow the same steps.
Great. Doctor, let's talk about the development. I'll take your question and then I'll go back to what I have in mind. Go ahead, Harry.
So my question specifically has to do with the economics of carbon capture and storage or direct air capture technologies. So if you look at current break-even costs, it's around minimum $100 per MMBTU, I believe. I don't know if that figure is realistic. $100 per MMBTU.
100. That's the price of MMBTU. That's the price of gas.
Gas, yeah. Or like basically the prices are quite high. They have very high break.
But you put it in the price of carbon, not gas.
Or the marginal abatement cost.
That's the price of carbon per ton.
Yes.
It has to be per ton.
So per ton.
So you put a price on carbon per ton, and that will pay off the direct capture cost or whatever.
Cost,
it has to be per carbon.
Yeah, it's quite high at the moment.
Well, not 100, because there was a study that I wanted to show. We published a study before on SABIC. We did a study for SABIC, and we found that the minimum price for carbon capture is something like $29. So today, prices of carbon, as you show in one of my graphs, is above 80 euros. So this is even more than $90. So I believe now prices are a bit high. But yeah, what was the second part of the question?
The thing is, with basically the prices for direct air capture technology or carbon capture are quite high.
Direct air, I think it's too difficult.
Yeah, my question is there, do you think with the current R&D and the current investment that's being pumped into such technologies, carbon capture and storage, is it feasible at the moment, and when should we expect it to be feasible?
I think direct air capture is very long on the way.
Yeah.
But it's CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. That's the one we should focus on. Just look into the US. There's a company called Occidental Petroleum. They did an amazing job in CO2 capture for enhanced recovery, reducing carbon emissions by 25% something. They did an absolutely marvelous job in CO2 for AOR, and I think that's what countries need to focus on now. And CO2 conversion into chemicals and polymers or other feedstocks. So it's far much more useful than direct air capture in the meantime. Certainly after 10 years from now, maybe we see breakthroughs in direct air capture, but for the meantime, I would be more optimistic about CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery, because there is an incentive out of that. We published a paper when I was at CAUS on that. I could have presented it, but I don't have my slides here. So, but you can if you Google my name on Scholar, that paper is published. I can share it.
There's a lot of hope writing on carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, and there is also
another paper that we did for SABIC. SABIC now is doing an amazing job in CO2 conversion for urea fertilizers. So I think that's where we should focus on for the meantime. Capturing carbon from carbon-intensive sources like power generation, cementing, steel. I think that should be the targets, or let's say the targets. Why? Because capturing carbon directly from air is extremely expensive. The CO2 concentration is very low, and to devise or to develop technologies that are capable of capturing all the CO2 directly from air will be extremely expensive over the next years until we see major breakthroughs. Iceland did already a very nice demonstration, but the amounts that they can capture is very low compared to what the world's need. But I think they have done a very good pilot scale project, if you can Google that, one in Iceland. Yeah, check that. I'm sure it will be interesting to you, because it's already running on a commercial scale, but it's small, still small.
Doctor, today we have most of our audiences are from or are young professionals. Now, for us young professionals working at the bottom of the hierarchy of the energy, we don't understand the trends, we don't understand the bigger picture. How important is it to concern ourselves with those, with the trends and bigger picture of the oil and gas industry? And what advice would you give to us in order to have a better understanding of the trends and what's going on?
Well, I would say reading is extremely important. When I came here, I told you, when I finished my PhD, I didn't understand how the oil industry operates. So when I joined the IAEA back in 2013, and I had to read policy briefs, it was like Chinese to me. I didn't understand what a policy brief is. So they told me you have to do a study and then write a recommendation for a policymaker. All right, so what does that really mean? So it was kind of hard. But that's why you need to try and understand the application of your field. When I was at KAUST, sadly, when I was at KAUST, and I met a lot of PhD students, and a few of them, very few, really knew what is the application of their project. They do a lot of science, which is amazing, all right, but they don't know what is the application. And they lack the most basic principles of economics. And they're doing PhDs when I was at KAUST. When I was at Imperial, the mindset of the researcher was very different. The researcher has to connect with an industry, and they do a PhD project, most of them, they do PhDs funded by the industry. So they know what is the application for the PhD project, and that is what we really lack in Saudi Arabia. I think we need to have our generations, our graduates, more capable of implementing ideas, not just teaching them with theories or giving them a lot of theories and they don't know what is the market behind that theory. So I would say, number one, you have to read and understand the application of your discipline. If you are petroleum engineers and you're working with design of rigs or drilling or production of reservoirs or AI or any of that smart technologies that you're doing, you need to understand, without economics, this business won't work. So, and especially if you want to go up in the hierarchy, as you mentioned, you need to be a leader. And if I didn't, when I finished my PhD, if I didn't connect with leaders, I wouldn't have been able now to write recommendations or articles that are designed for leaders to read. So you have to connect with leaders and understand what leaders need from you. And of course you have to read and understand the application of your business and try to match the gap between what you're doing and what the market wants. Essentially, try to make a business out of your field. And this is how entrepreneurs really become entrepreneurs. Maybe they spend years in the lab, and after spending years in the lab, they have a new technology, then they become the CEO and wearing suits, going to their companies. I have many of my friends at Imperial who left Imperial College and now they have companies whether it's in biomedicine or catalysis or any other, these SMEs doing a lot of this interesting work. So this is what you need to do. You need to read. One important thing is you're attending conferences. When you attend conferences, you listen to leaders in the industry and what they talk about, then you start developing the knowledge. When I was doing my PhD, I attended maybe a lot of events that even the Cultural Bureau, when the head of the student affairs at the Cultural Bureau, this Mulhaqiyya al-Saudiya, used to tell me that I think you got more than attending these events than your PhD itself. So when I come to him, I tell him, oh, I went to that conference, and he was impressed, I think. And then he told me, I think you got more benefits from these conferences than what you got from Imperial College. So I think attending conference, networking with people, and really listening to what the market needs, that all of that will guide you through your career path. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be to where I am now, in my profession. And I think that's my advice to you as young engineers. Maybe you want to continue your further studies, masters or PhDs or whatever. Ensure that you continue in the subject that you like, that you want to grow in. All right.